Welcome back to The Explainer. Today, we're jumping 2,500 years back in time to ancient Greece to unpack a genuine comedic masterpiece, Aristophanes' play, The Acharnians. It's an incredibly fascinating and honestly, surprisingly relatable look at ancient satire and the very real political world it was mocking.
Picture this for a second. You're living in a city that's been locked in a brutal, unending war for years. The economy is in ruins, farms are being torched, and you are literally starving. You're so utterly fed up with your leaders refusing to stop the fighting that you just take matters into your own hands. You completely bypass the government and negotiate a private peace treaty, just for yourself, your family, and your estate. You basically declare yourself a sovereign, neutral nation. Sounds like a ridiculous premise for a modern sitcom, right? Well, that is the exact hook of the very first surviving play we have from Aristophanes.
Okay, let's dive into this. Here is our roadmap. First, Athens at war. Second, a private peace treaty. Third, tasting the truces. Fourth, satire and the free market. And finally, Aristophanes versus Cleon.
Section 1. Athens at War, the grim reality. Now, to really appreciate the comedy here, we absolutely have to understand the incredibly dark historical stakes surrounding it.
Take a look at this. The Acharnians opens right here at the Pnyx, which is a prominent hill in central Athens. But it wasn't just any hill, it was the literal gathering place for popular assemblies. It was the physical and political heart of early democracy. So by starting the play right here, Aristophanes is immediately throwing his audience into the absolute core of their city's decision-making.
And, those decisions were literally life and death. The play debuted at the Linnea Festival in 425 BC. To put that into perspective, that is the 6th year of the Peloponnesian War. For half a decade, Spartans and their allies had been invading Attica every single year, burning and looting farms just to try and force a land battle. The Athenians were holed up behind their city walls, dealing with daily privations, starvation, and plague. Industry and agriculture were completely wrecked. So, this grim, desperate reality, that's exactly what the audience was living through when they sat down to watch this comedy.
Which brings us to Section 2, a private peace treaty, the absurd solution. Because how on earth does an ancient comedian tackle that kind of depressing reality? With a totally radical and absurd solution. Meet our protagonist, Dicapolis. He's a middle-aged Athenian assemblyman, and he is just done with the war. He shows up to the assembly ready to shout down and interrupt anyone who talks about anything other than peace. But when the politicians completely ignore his peace-at-any-price platform, he goes rogue. He sends an envoy to Sparta to negotiate a private, exclusive peace just for his household. He bypasses the state entirely so he can just go back to his country home and harvest his crops.
But, as you can imagine, you can't just secede from a major war without making a few enemies at home. Enter the chorus, known as the Acharnians. They're this angry mob of elderly charcoal burners and farmers. They're tough war veterans whose lands were completely destroyed by the Spartans, so they despise the very idea of peace. They actually view Dicapolis as a massive traitor and are quite literally ready to stone him. So how does our guy survive? In a moment of pure, ridiculous slapstick, Dicapolis grabs a coal basket, which is obviously super precious to these charcoal burners, and holds it hostage. He threatens to dismember the basket with a sword until they agree to hear him out. It's just a brilliant, hilarious way to visualize political opposition.
Moving on to Section 3, tasting the truces, visualizing the metaphor. Here's where Aristophanes really shows his genius for turning abstract ideas into amazing sensory comedy.
So, Dicapolis' envoy, Amphitheus, gets back from Sparta with the potential peace treaties. But instead of just handing over a boring scroll of paper, the treaties are presented comically, almost like wine samples for Dicapolis to taste and try. First up, the 5-year truce. He immediately spits it out. He's like, "Fa," because it reeks of pitch and navel tar. It's a wonderfully tactile detail that shows a short truce is really just a pause to gear up for more fighting.
Next, he samples the 10-year truce. Nope, rejected too. Why? Because this one smells strongly of the diplomatic delegates going around chiding their allies. It perfectly captures the friction, the delays, and just the deeply annoying reality of slow-moving politicians stringing everyone along. But then we get to the 30-year truce. This is the one. Dicapolis is absolutely delighted by it. It basically gives him permission to go wherever he wants, and he ratifies this magnificent treaty by just chugging the whole thing down in a single gulp.
Now, what's really interesting here is the specific language she uses. Dicapolis says this 30-year truce has the aroma of nectar and ambrosia, the literal food and drink of the immortal gods.
Aristophanes is giving his audiences vivid sensory contrast. The smell of war is foul tar and sweaty politicians, but the fragrance of lasting peace, that is divine. It symbolizes a full restoration of the joys of life.
Section 4. Satire and the free market, the comedic execution. So now that he's his own sovereign nation, Dicapolis sets up a private marketplace, completely free from the trade bans that are starving the rest of Athens. He opens up shop to enemies who were traditionally banned, like the Megarians, and this leads to one of the darkest yet most famous comedic scenes in the play. A starving Megarian shows up to the market, but he doesn't have any actual goods to sell. Instead, he disguises his own young daughters as sucking pigs to sell them for food. It's this chaotic, absurd, old comedy trade, but it makes a really sharp, biting point about the literal starvation those trade embargoes were causing.
Then we get another rapid-fire joke. A Boeotian trader arrives with local goods, and what does he want in exchange? Well, Dicapolis trades him an Athenian informer, basically a government market spy. They actually pack this annoying guy into a crate like a cheap clay pot and carry him off. It's hilarious, but it's also Dicapolis explicitly kicking the corrupt political apparatus out of his peaceful little utopia.
Aristophanes really hammers this all home at the end of the play with a striking visual side-by-side comparison between the miseries of war and the joys of peace. On one side of the stage, you've got the blustering General Lamachus. He's ordered out into the freezing snow to guard the borders, and he eventually comes back wounded, in agony, and just totally miserable. On the exact opposite side, you have Dicapolis. He's safe at home getting ready for the Feast of Cups, surrounded by wine and dainties, throwing this huge, riotous, drunken party. It's just this undeniable visual argument showing the audience exactly what they're missing out on by staying at war.
And that leads us to our final section, number 5. Aristophanes versus Cleon, the real-world stakes. Because to fully grasp the genius here, we have to look off the stage.
I want you to really think about this for a second. Athens is a democracy, sure, but it's a democracy actively fighting for its survival. The pro-war faction is firmly in charge, and yet Aristophanes puts on a play that openly mocks the military leaders, highlights civilian suffering, and basically argues that making peace with the enemy is the only sane choice. Doing that in real life took incredible courage.
For Aristophanes, this wasn't just some generic anti-war statement. This play was actually a daring act of calculated political revenge against the most powerful man in Athens, the pro-war demagogue Cleon.
Here is the political backstory that makes this so potent. Before the Acharnians, Aristophanes wrote a play called The Babylonians, which was performed in front of foreigners. Cleon, who led the democratic pro-war faction, was absolutely furious about it, and he actually prosecuted the playwright for slandering the city. So the Acharnians was Aristophanes' spirited response to that political intimidation. The play fiercely critiques what it frames as Cleon's selfish and reckless policy. By showing a completely average citizen pulling off peace while the entire establishment fails, Aristophanes was publicly ridiculing Cleon's political platform.
And that really highlights the enduring power of this work. The Acharnians is way more than just a 2,500-year-old script about a guy and a basket of coal. It's an absolute masterclass in using humor to speak truth to power during a time of immense crisis. Which leaves us with a pretty fascinating question to ponder. If a simple comedy could so boldly challenge the most powerful politicians and policies in ancient Athens, what modern satires are shaping our history today? Keep an eye out for them. Thank you so much for joining me to explore this incredible piece of history, and I'll see you in the next Explainer.